Hello, everybody. Happy New Year, and welcome to a new series on the Philosophy Academy studying the course of Epistemology. This lesson will be taking an introduction to the subject of epistemology, and then what we will be doing is unpacking essentially the purpose of this study, thinking about what epistemology actually is, thinking about how we can define knowledge. A little bit of a spoiler alert there for those of you who want to know what epistemology is. You get an idea. It's something to do with knowledge, okay? And that's as far as I'll go, and I'll talk about it more in a second. We'll then also talk about the scope of this series of videos. This is going to provide you with an introductory overview of some of the most important and specific topics within the subject of epistemology. And so it's important that you get an understanding of where we're going to be going, the things that we're going to be talking about. And then we will finish by thinking about citations reading and further reading on this topic, because of course I can't cover everything in these lessons. They would be particularly long if I did. And so this is, like I said, supposed to provide you with a nice overview, a nice maybe even revision material for those of you who maybe have exams in the subject of epistemology. And so for those of you who want to dive into specific aspects of these videos in more detail, then there will be a further reading section at the end of every single lesson. So with that being said then, what is epistemology? It is an area of philosophy, as you can probably imagine, and it is a branch of philosophy that studies the nature, the scope, as well as the limits of knowledge. More broadly, you could define epistemology as just simply the philosophy of knowledge, the study of knowledge, thinking theoretically about knowledge, about how knowledge is acquired, the kind of ways in which people can come to beliefs that they have, the scope of knowledge and the limits of being able to experience and have understanding of various things and to know about certain things. And really from that definition, we can think about all of the things that epistemology is concerned in. It is concerned in the understanding of how we know what we know, for example. Things like how our beliefs can be justified. If somebody asks you what you believe in and you reply with a particular answer, and they were to ask you why you believe the things that you believe, then the question of justification is essentially a philosophical question and an epistemological question. It also is the study of the processes by which knowledge is acquired, the processes by which knowledge is validated, how we are able to apply knowledge in certain circumstances. The word itself comes from the Greek. It's a combination of words, so episteme meaning knowledge and logos meaning study or discourse. So the sort of ology part of any word is the study of whatever it is that you are thinking about. So that is one of the things that is important to remember. It's the study of knowledge from the sort of from an epistemological kind of perspective. So when we think then about epistemology, we can conclude that an epistemologist will try to define what it actually means to know something. If I say, for example, that I know that tomorrow is going to be Thursday, what does it actually mean when I say that? How is it that I can justify my belief in that particular knowledge? What kind of knowledge is that anyway? What type of knowledge is it? Are there different types of knowledge? And why is it that I feel that I can actually say with a certain degree of certainty that I know for a fact that it's going to be Thursday tomorrow? This leads to an exploration of a number of different theories of knowledge. The classical theory of knowledge, which will be the topic of the next lesson in more detail, is sometimes known as the theory of justified true belief. This is the theory of knowledge which asserts that in order for someone to know something, three conditions must be satisfied. The first of these conditions is belief, i.e., that person must believe in a proposition. So let's say the proposition, John is 6 foot tall, okay? That is a proposition that has a truth statement. It's either true or false, simply put, because all propositions are. And in order for me to understand and to know that to be the case, I might go through the classical theory of knowledge and think about justified true belief. And so I must believe, firstly, that the proposition is in fact true. The person must believe the proposition. That proposition then must also be true. Just because somebody believes a thing, a proposition, does not necessarily mean that that proposition is true. Take the proposition, John is immortal. That is a proposition which I might believe, but it will not be true, because humans aren't immortal, and that's just a thing that we know. And of course, there will be very valid reasons for why we can show that that proposition is false. So the second conclusion that needs to be noted is that in order, according to this classical theory of knowledge, for somebody to be justified and to know something, that proposition must also be true. And there must be justification. So not only must you believe the proposition and the proposition to be true, but the person must also have an adequate justification for believing it. Now, we'll get to what justification actually means in topic number 3 on this series, and all the various theories of justification. But the classical theory of knowledge asserts these 3 propositions. Now, there are definitely challenges and problems with this classical theory of knowledge, and those are challenges and problems that we will be getting to over the next few lessons. But just as a sort of introduction, this is known as the justified true belief theory of knowledge. Justification, then, is something that is really important for when we think about knowledge, because in order for you to believe something, you must be justified in your belief in a particular thing. And epistemologists explore what actually counts as valid justification for believing something. And it involves the scrutinizing of different forms of evidence, scrutinizing of the different methods of reasoning. Some people might believe something to be the case, and it might even be the case that that is true, that what they believe, but their methods, their methodology of reasoning to arrive at that particular conclusion might be faulty. So, for example, if I say, I know that the sky is blue, well, the proposition first exists, and I believe in the proposition that the sky is blue. The proposition is also true. The sky is in fact blue. But what if my belief in that is justified on the basis that I believe that aliens came down and painted the skies before humans arrived? Well, that is where we get a bit of a problem. My methodology of reasoning, my form of evidence of concluding that particular foundation is probably not correct. And so my justification for believing that proposition might be something that we can question, even though the proposition itself is true and I believe in the proposition. So just bear that in mind. So there are obviously lots of different ways of reasoning. There are different examples of evidence, such as empirical observation, coherence with other beliefs, foundational beliefs themselves, all of which that do not necessarily maybe even require justification. So we'll get to that, like I said, when we look at foundationalism and when we look at coherentism in our studies on the justification of knowledge. And that nice and neatly segues us to the final point of this lesson, where I will just go through what this series of lessons is going to be exploring. We'll be taking, like I said at the start, an introductory series on the study of epistemology. Specifically, we're going to be studying 7 major topics. The first is the question of what knowledge actually is. This involves a number of different theories. The classical theory of knowledge that I mentioned earlier on, challenges associated with it, alternative theories of knowledge, as well as the relationship that exists between knowledge and truth. We will then think about the different sources of knowledge, dipping our toes a little bit into things like the philosophy of perception, the idea of reason, introspection, testimony, and memory, all of which are very important elements and aspects of the philosophy of knowledge, specifically thinking about where knowledge comes from. We'll think about the various different the different theories associated with the justification of knowledge, internalism and externalism, foundationalism, coherentism, virtue epistemology, and we'll think about some of the problems associated with some of these theories, things like the problem of infinite regress, before we then move on to thinking about ways in which we can challenge different conceptions of knowledge, such as skepticism and the role that skepticism plays in epistemology. We will then look at empiricism and rationalism, the idea that knowledge first comes from experience, and then on the other hand, the theory of rationalism, that knowledge comes from reason, before we then start thinking about some of the philosophies relating to David Hume, the idea of the challenge of inductive reasoning by people like David Hume, before finally focusing on some of the more cutting-edge areas of epistemology, looking at social and political epistemology, thinking about issues such as misinformation and disinformation in social media, thinking about public reasoning and democracy, thinking about epistemic injustice and some of the writings of people like Miranda Fricker, for example, thinking about the idea of group knowledge and collective epistemology and collective memory, and some of the problems that are associated with reliance and reliability of collective memory. All of those are going to be covered towards the end of this series and looking at some of the more modern and sort of the more, like I said, cutting-edge areas of epistemology. In terms of a variety of sources and thinking about epistemology and thinking about what you could think about in relation to that, obviously for a very brief introductory look, you could look at the short introduction to knowledge, but more detail is probably the Routledge Handbook, specifically the Routledge Introduction to Epistemology. It's part of their Contemporary Introduction to Philosophy series that's been going on for years now, and is a really good selection of textbooks on a variety of different areas of philosophy, not just the study of epistemology. And they sort of market the Routledge textbooks. They sort of market themselves as quote unquote contemporary introductions, but they probably bring you to a level of understanding of a particular philosophical topic of somebody who is probably like completing a university degree, so sort of undergraduate level. And I know that for a fact because I remember when I studied philosophy at undergrad, things like the philosophy of mind, of course, were the required reading for a lot of those modules and for a lot of those topics was the Philosophy of Mind Contemporary Introduction, written by John Heil. And so it's sort of, they market themselves as a contemporary introduction, but they're a little bit more advanced than that, in my opinion. Even further reading and more advanced reading would include thinking about, for example, the Oxford Handbook of Epistemology, as well as the Anthology of Epistemology from Blackwell. These are both really, really thick, dense sources that cover a number of different cutting-edge issues from a collection of different essays, especially the Oxford Handbook. And then, of course, if there are any additional papers and theories and ideas and readings that I will be referencing throughout, I'll put them in the at the end of the page as well, or I'll cite them as and when I get to them throughout the series. So bear that in mind for future Letters Time, and I hope to see everybody next week when we start thinking about epistemology in a bit more detail, specifically starting to talk about the classical theory of knowledge.